Ladies and gentlemen, welcome and thank you for joining today's conference, Using Underwater Video to Monitor Fish Around Ocean and River Energy Devices. All participant lines will be muted until the Q&A portion of the call, and we will provide you with instructions at that time. You are welcome to submit written questions during the presentation. To submit a written question, use the chat panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Choose All Panelists from the Send To drop-down menu. Please note that there will be pre-recorded videos played on today's session. Audio will rely on your computer speakers, so please ensure that they are unmuted. If you require any technical assistance, send a note to the event producer. With that, I'll turn the call over to Sherry Matzner, Senior Engineer with Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. Please go ahead.
Hi, yes. Thank you all for joining us today. So the motivation for this talk today is that we would like to develop sustainable energy from our oceans and rivers and at the same time minimize any negative effects on the environment. So in order to do that, we really need to gather more data. We need to learn as we go, start with some small-scale projects, and collect good data as we go forward. So today I'm going to talk about using video to collect some of that data that will help us better understand interaction between energy devices and wildlife. And the talk is organized as follows. I'll talk a little bit about doing some planning when you're going to use video. I'll provide some video recording guidelines. And then the bulk of the talk will be about automated analysis methods. And then I will give a short demonstration of some software we're developing to help you do that. So why use video? There's a number of advantages. It's easy to interpret. Everyone, you don't have to be an expert to look at it. Generally, the equipment costs less, and it generates less data in general than something like a multi-beam sonar or an acoustic camera, which are also sensors that can be used for this purpose, and video can be complementary to those other types of sensors. But I think really the main advantage is that we can leverage a huge body of research aimed at automating video analytics. And that's really a huge advantage. And in general, you will want to use video when you want to make close-range observations of individual animals, when it's important to identify the species, and when you want to study their behavior kind of close into, say, the energy devices or some structure like a mooring. Because video will allow you to identify these details better than some of the other types of sensors that I've mentioned. So when you're planning to use video, the most important thing I want to emphasize is to do some planning ahead of time and really think about the size of the targets that you want to observe and how far away from the camera you would likely be observing them, and then use that information to determine the characteristics of the camera that's going to give you the best video possible. And this is very important, especially if you would like to automate the analysis of that video, and I'm sure you would like to do that. And so there's a very simple equation that relates the size of the target, the distance, the camera characteristics, namely the field of view, and the resolution of the camera in pixels, and that determines how large in pixels the image of the target will be. So using this simple equation, which you could enter into a spreadsheet, that's usually what I do, and then you can play around with some different what-if scenarios, and keeping in mind that in general, if the image of the target is greater than 5 pixels, say, in one dimension, it's likely to be detectable. And now if you want it to actually be identifiable, either as fish or seal or, at that taxonomic level, let alone to species, you probably want to aim to have it be about 100 pixels or larger. And this is kind of just a rough rule of thumb, but it's a very important thing to kind of calculate up front. And, of course, the other thing you might want to consider is the area of coverage that you want to cover. Are you going to need just one camera? Will that be sufficient, or will you need multiple cameras? And some other considerations while you're in the planning stage, think about illumination. Now, if you want to make observations at night, you will definitely need some kind of illumination, and that could be infrared sources or visible light sources. And also, the greater the depth that your cameras will be deployed at, the less ambient light that will be available. So, if you're in deeper water, you may need illumination all the time. Another consideration is the data rate. So how are you going to record video continuously? Are you going to, record for 10 minutes every hour, some kind of duty cycle like that? And so then you can calculate the data rate in bytes per second, and that can help you understand how much storage you need to have on board if you're going to record all the data and store it on board some kind of autonomous system, or even if you're cabled back to shore, you're still going to store that data somewhere, and you're going to be transferring it over the cable. So it's nice to kind of just do that calculation and understand what the data rate is. You might also want to think about optimizing for automated analysis in the end. And in that case, you want to use the best resolution possible. And so that's going to increase the data rate. But you could consider using grayscale rather than color in order to reduce the bit rate a little bit. If you want to capture motion features, which I'll talk about later, you want to record at probably at least 25 frames per second in order to capture motion. So those are some things to think about when you're planning your video acquisition. And now I'm just going to say a few brief things about the actual acquisition itself. There's a number of different underwater cameras out there to choose from. These are just a couple of examples. And in fact, the folks from Boulder AI will be presenting after me, and they will give you a lot more details about the different types of cameras and recording systems that are available. The other thing besides the cameras is something called a network video recorder that can be used. It's like a DVR, and it can record the streams from multiple cameras if you are using multiple cameras, and it will kind of optimize how that data gets stored. However, when you're choosing an NVR, make sure that it's easy to export the recorded data into some standard format, preferably MP4, which is pretty universal, because a lot of times these network video recorders use kind of a proprietary format that makes it difficult to work with except within their proprietary software. So make sure you can export that in a standard format. Pay attention to their rated frame rate and channel capacity. And then as a bonus, some of these NVRs offer a programming API, which means you can write scripts to control the recording, to extract the video, and sort of integrate that with other software that you may be using to do the automated analysis. So that's a really nice thing if you can kind of look for that feature. And then this, I'm just going to show you a quick example of a acquisition system that was used by Ocean Renewable Power Company, one of our collaborators. This was a pilot project they had near the village of Igiugig in Alaska, where they put this in-stream turbine in a river, and they included 5 cameras where you can see where those were placed. So they covered the area of interest, both upstream and downstream of the device. They included a couple of lights and So that's the equipment that they use, CMate underwater cameras, and a dedicated micros DVR. And there's just a couple of examples of what the images look like from those cameras. So now I'm going to talk about the analysis of the video. So now you've done your planning, you've deployed your system, you're starting to record data. Now what? Well, the standard method for analyzing the video and extracting information is still human expert review for the most part. Now, the advantages of using human experts is that they're very, very good at identifying species. And they can also provide a lot of detailed information about the animal's behavior. You know, they can note things like animal, was feeding, or animal, avoided the device, or whatever it is. But of course, there's disadvantages to this too. It's extremely time-consuming and labor-intensive. Normally what happens is the human expert will, play the video on their screen, maybe running it, kind of fast-forwarding, stopping when they see something interesting, going back and forth, typing an entry into a spreadsheet, and it's just very time-consuming. And of course, when it comes to human labor, time is money, so it becomes costly. And also, there's a delay between actually collecting the data and then having the information that you're trying to get at be available. So there can be quite a time delay there, and it can impact schedules of a project if you're relying on that information. So what we need to do is automate that analysis so that we can make using video more cost-effective and increase the scientific value. Of course, automating it is challenging. In general, underwater video suffers from low contrast. The colors may look different than you're expecting because the different wavelengths propagate through the water with different attenuation levels. The background can be somewhat dynamic. And then in particular, sites where ocean or river energy projects are going to take place usually are characterized by very strong currents. Of course, the energy device itself may be in motion, so that may cause some additional turbidity in the water and or bubbles, that sort of thing. There may be quite a bit of clutter or floating debris. So all these things are challenging. In the course of our work, we've kind of come up with this roadmap for automation. So in light of all those challenges, we kind of came up with a phased approach to automation, where the initial phase would just be to help automate the workflow itself. So you still have human analysts doing the bulk of the analysis, but you have a nice framework software that allows them to do the playback, to enter their annotations directly into the software, saves it all in a database, and has some tools for visualization. And then the next phase would be to at least automate the detection of fish or other animals of interest. And so this would save the time for the human reviewers. They could just jump immediately to a detected event and spend their time, identifying whether it's a fish or a seal or whatever it is that's of interest. And then the next step would be to actually do that classification automatically as well, and perhaps even classify to some taxonomic level, whether it's species or just family or group. And then building on that, the ability to track individual animals in the video would allow one to count the animals. So rather than just saying there's a fish in this frame, there's a fish in the next frame, but you don't know for sure if that's the same fish, if you're tracking the animals, then you can say for certain that it is the same fish, and you can come up with accurate counts, which may or may not be important depending on your study objectives or the purpose of your monitoring. And then finally, it would be great if all this software and automation could actually work on board with the cameras and you could have fully autonomous platforms that would do a lot of this analysis close to the camera so that you don't have to save all this raw video data, you don't have to transmit it, you just put the cameras down there and you get back information. And again, I think the next presentation from the Boulder AI folks will talk a little bit about that. So our project that we have here at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory is called EyeSea, and the objectives for that project are to develop an open source software framework that will kind of address those first two items of automation, to provide a platform to manage the workflow and do this using user-friendly software that you don't have to be a computer scientist to use. And the idea is that then developers working in this wider video analytics community would contribute algorithms that could easily be plugged into this framework. And so that way, instead of trying to come up with some algorithms that may be state-of-the-art now, but that become out of date in a year from now, this way the software can continuously evolve as the state-of-the-art in machine learning and computer vision evolves as well. We're planning to release the open source software in October of this year, and with that first release, we plan to include at least one detection algorithm, so an algorithm that can just detect when there's fish in the scene or not, and we will include at least one deep learning model. So I just want to tell you about a couple of related projects that are going on. So if you're interested in video analytics, you may want to check these out. There's a project called Fish for Knowledge that took place a few years ago, and they had cameras. I think they were deployed off the coast of Taiwan, and they had multiple cameras recording 24/7 for I want to say maybe 2 years, but it was a lot of data. And so they developed some code, which is open source, it's available now, to manage the workflow. They included several different detection, tracking, and classification algorithms that the user can choose from. And the researchers are extremely helpful in helping you, compile and install that code. Now, just a caveat that the code was last updated in 2013, so it may be a little bit out of date, but we did use this code base when we first started this work, and so that kind of gave us a jump up on what we were trying to do. Now, a more recent effort known as VIAME, which stands for Video and Image Analytics for a Marine Environment. This is a project that is coming out of NOAA, National Marine Fisheries Service, and they started a strategic internal initiative to develop automated processing for video, because NOAA, uses video quite a bit in their own research. And so they teamed up with a private company called Kitware to develop this open source code. And it does have some modules for, I think, workflow management, for detection, classification. I think they're working on a tracking module. And they also have some data sets that you can download and use for your own development. So that's another potential resource. The Nature Conservancy had a cable challenge. I don't think there's been a lot of activity around that. And then just recently, I learned that the California Energy Commission has funded some research at Cal Poly to develop automated classification of fish in underwater video. So that one's just about to start up, so that's something we'll be keeping an eye on. For our project, we have acquired 4 different data sets that together, represent a nice diversity in location, camera resolution, frame rate, the types of species that are represented. And so we really appreciate the sharing of this data by our collaborators, Aquaterra, Ocean Renewable Power Company and a public utility district here in the state of Washington who uses video to record fish going through their dam. And another data set that was recorded by the University of Washington here at our Marine Sciences Lab. And that data set has some diving birds in it, which is kind of interesting. But you can see the variety in the resolution, the frame rate, and what those videos look like. And actually, I'd like to just play a couple samples of that for you, if I might. I think I will just try to do it this way. So this is an example of the fish going through the viewing window. This is fairly high resolution, and it's kind of nice starter for developing automation because the fish will, for the most part, be occurring, you know, down in this part of the screen. They're always kind of from the same aspect angle sideways. So this is from the Ocean Renewable Power data set, and this is the first data set that we had to work with. This is from one of the cameras that was recorded during the night, so the illumination source kind of washes out the fish a little bit. You can see there's a lot of artifacts from the digitization of the video, and there's kind of a lot of noise and clutter. And this is a lower resolution video. And let's take a look at the diving bird. So this was during the day. The bird's going to come up from the bottom. There it goes. So this is just a grayscale video, and it has that diving bird in it. You could see that was kind of low contrast. And then finally, this is an example where there were multiple camera feeds combined into a single video. You have a device where there's some motion from the device itself. There's a cable or something that's kind of floating around. There were some focus issues with some of the cameras. But overall, it was a good, it was a higher frame rate and fairly good resolution. So that just gives you an example of some of the diversity that we can encounter in underwater video. And so the challenge is, can we come up with an analysis method that will work on any of those videos? Well, the first thing we did was to use a computer vision approach. And so this is kind of a standard approach where you first subject the raw video to some kind of pre-processing, which may include histogram equalization. That's an algorithm that can help increase the contrast in images. Bilateral filter is an algorithm for reducing noise, kind of smoothing things out but preserving edges. So those were a couple of techniques we looked at. And then once you apply that pre-processing, then we applied a technique called background subtraction. This is a computer vision technique that's been around for a while, and basically it uses some statistics computed over, you know, maybe some window of the video, say 10 seconds, 30 seconds, and comes up with what the background of the video is, even if that background is dynamic and includes motion, and then is able to separate out what's called foreground objects, which are hopefully the objects of interest to you. However, there may be a lot of false positives, and so the next step in that processing chain is usually to classify those detections as either, in our case, fish or not a fish. And so for that, we used a couple of different techniques. Port vector machine, we also looked at linear discriminant analysis. Both of those approaches require what's called training data. So you have to have some data where you know what the answer is, and so that you can develop those classifiers. We also looked at calculating the optical flow, which is a computer vision technique that quantifies motion from frame to frame And there's several different algorithms for doing that available. And the thinking there was that the motion of the fish would be different than the motion of other things in the scene. We found that to be a little challenging, so we didn't pursue that during the first phase of our investigation. And like I said earlier, the original data set we had to work with was the Igiugig data set, and so the results we got using that was pretty okay. The background subtractant itself worked reasonably well. It could detect the majority of the fish. However, there were a number of false positives. And so this table you can see here is a breakdown of how well we could detect the fish based on the size in pixels of the objects. And so this goes back to what I was saying earlier, where you really want to kind of plan out and select your camera to make sure that the targets you're interested in will be large enough in terms of pixels in order to be detected and identified. So there you see, yeah, it detects the fish pretty well, but there's some false positives. So deep learning can solve everything, right? So that's what we're looking at now is more of a deep learning, machine learning approach. And I think, there's been a lot of success reported early on with machine learning being able to recognize, dogs and cats and refrigerators and so forth in imagery from the internet. And so that's great, but I think there's going to be a little bit of a period of disillusionment as people start, applying these techniques to real-world data, but there's definitely a lot of promise. So the way, for example, a deep learning approach would work is that first you select an architecture, and you've probably heard of something called convolutional neural networks. That's probably the most, commonly used form for detecting things in images. It's good at detecting spatial features in a way that's invariant to translation, so it doesn't matter where in the scene they occur. There's also a form called recurrent neural networks that's used for time series prediction, and you can combine these two different sort of basic models into some more complicated architecture. Once you've selected your architecture, then you need to train the model to perform the task that you're interested in. In our case, detect, possibly track fish or other animals in underwater video. And at this stage, you can either train from scratch and just kind of start with a blank slate, or now there are many pre-trained models that have been trained on some of these public data sets that you can start with one of them and then do what's called fine-tuning to make it recognize the types of targets that you're interested in. But either way, this training is the part that requires a large volume of labeled data and can also be very computationally intense. This is where you've probably heard of using multiple GPUs, multiple cores, even supercomputers to perform this task. But once the model is trained, now the model itself can run on like a mobile phone. So it's just really the training that can be computationally intense, but once you have a working model, now it can be integrated into your application and run on just kind of standard platforms. So this is just an example of downloading one of these pre-trained models. It was trained on a data set called ImageNet, which includes over 1,000 different classes of objects. But this was an early architecture that could not really localize different objects within the image, and it really just classified the entire image. So on the left, you see if we presented an image from the Fish Passage Dam viewing window, you see that it can't really recognize what that is. And it takes a few guesses, but the scores are not very high. But now if we crop that image and present just the fish so that the fish is in the center of the image, now the model can recognize it. And these results are just from a model that was just downloaded from the internet and used as is. So then people then moved on from just classifying an image to actually localizing objects within an image and then classifying them. So you've probably heard of this architecture called YOLO. It stands for You Only Look Once. And so this is one thing we're looking at now. The model that we downloaded was pre-trained on a data set called COCO. It doesn't include as many classes as the ImageNet data set, and it does not include any class for fish. So if the model has not been trained to recognize fish, it's just not going to recognize fish. And in this case, it does localize the fish in the image, but it calls it a bird. Which, okay, that's a pretty good guess. And so we're in the process right now of training this architecture with our data so that it can recognize fish. But really, what we think is going to be the key to developing sort of a universal approach that's going to work with any of those videos and any future videos that are recorded is to use motion features. The human reviewers that we've talked to have said that they really use motion as a cue to recognize fish, especially the very small fish in the videos. And so you can think about motion features kind of two different types. It could be localized motion of just the body parts, the way the tail moves, the way fins may move, maybe even gills. And then also the motion of the fish through the entire space. So fish tend to maybe dart. They can swim against the current or stay in one place when other things may be moving along in the current. So this is just an example of the optical flow, which, as I said, was a little problematic for the underwater video, but this was an example where there was a fish in the scene, and you can see that the motion of the fish is definitely different than the motion of the other things that were in the scene. And one way to capture that using the deep learning approach is to use 3D convolution features in two-dimensional images, but use a sequence of images, the frames from a video, and include a temporal component in there, and so that you can start learning motion features. And this was a very recent architecture that was reported in the literature that we are currently investigating that is able to do detection and tracking all in one processing pipeline by combining these 3D convolutional layers with a recurrent module that can basically do the tracking part of it. So this was successfully applied to detecting birds around wind turbines. And so there's a lot of similarities to that sort of application to detecting fish around MHK devices. So this is another thing we're currently investigating. So just to recap really quick, use video when you want to observe individual animals, when you want to classify them to species, and make sure to select the right camera to accomplish what you're trying to do, and that will be amenable to automated processing later. Record in a standard format. Try to avoid compression artifacts as much as possible. Consider using grayscale maybe to reduce the data rate. And then finally, for analysis, background subtraction is kind of an easy, tried and true method that can do pretty well for detection. Deep learning models require a little more training, but there's a lot of promise there. And our motion features may be the key to a universal underwater video fish detector. And with that, I'm going to give you a quick demonstration of our EyeSea software. So I'm opening a browser. We decided to make this software be a web-based application, and the advantage to that is that it can run on your Mac, your PC, your iPad, even your mobile phone, theoretically. So that's why we chose to do it that way. And when you open the application, you will see a thumbnail view of any videos that are part of your data set. And if the file name's too long, you can mouse over it, see the full file name. You'll see the duration of the video. And underneath the video, if you've applied any type of analysis to that video, you will see the results in the form of little bar graph showing where fish were detected in the video. So you get a real quick visual of how many fish are in the video. You can see which videos have been analyzed already or not. You can click a button here to add new videos as they become available. And when you add a video, you can select an algorithm to automate the analysis. And this is where we're imagining there will be a list of algorithms available to choose from, and this list will evolve as developers develop new algorithms. And so you can select an algorithm, you can display the parameters, the settings for that algorithm, you can adjust those to work best with your particular video. And then when the analysis is complete, you will see this summary page that will show the results in two different ways. This heat map shows you where the fish were detected, so it's like the spatial distribution of where fish occurred in the scene from your video. And then down below, you'll also see that temporal distribution of when the fish occurred in the video. And what we're showing here, this is just kind of a mock-up of what that screen would look like. You could apply more than one algorithm to your video and see the various results and compare them. You will also see a summary on the right-hand side. It'll tell you the total number of fish that were detected, the total number of events, where we define an event as like one of these contiguous sequences of frames where fish were present, the percent of time when fish were present in the video, some statistics on the size of the detections in pixels, the minimum, average, maximum size, and the time when the majority of the detections occurred. So now if we go back here, we can click on one of these videos and see the details. So actually, let's go back and let's look at this. This one's kind of interesting. So again, you'll see the video. You'll see where in the video there are detections, and you can play the video, and there will be boxes drawn around the fish. Now, these that we're looking at were done manually. This was part of our effort to label the data that we had. So these were done by human analysis. But this tool will support, doing that sort of analysis as well. And then we can look at the actual heat map, the spatial distribution of where the fish occur for that video. Not surprising, they're mostly here. But now if we look at the map for one of the Igiugig videos, you can really see the usefulness of this type of visualization. So here you have the device. You can kind of see that in the background. And you can see where the fish were observed, mostly, relative to that device. All right, and so with that, then that concludes my part of the presentation, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Darren Autumn of Boulder AI, and he'll talk to you more about it. All right.
Awesome presentation and so much amazing information that you guys have pulled together there. I want to thank you and Pacific Northwest National Labs for the opportunity to speak. I'm CEO of Boulder AI and co-founder of Seaception. We make super intelligent edge computing cameras, and as Sherry indicated, the selection of the camera matters, and as we move forward in progress and analysis of video, edge computing is becoming more and more important. And I'll go into more what that means. On the line here, I've got another co-founder of Seaception, Trevor Mendelow. Trevor also has started a number of organizations for underwater video capture, View into Blue, Teams for Oceans, and has quite a bit of experience in putting cameras underwater. My particular experience in underwater video processing started in about 2009, doing fish trawling video, species ID, and back in that time we were mostly working on support vector machines. But ever since this revolution of deep neural networks and convolutional neural nets has really hit the mainstream in 2012, we really saw a need for pushing as much computing power out to the edge as possible. So we founded a smart camera company that is really general purpose. So we can take we've actually put a GPU inside of a camera. So a GPU, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, is a really general purpose processor that can take any algorithm. So when we talk about algorithms or projects like VME, we can take a project like that in the open source domain and move it to the camera fairly easily. So what that means is that you as researchers or biologists even can take these algorithms that are in the open source domain and put it into a device to distill data where the data exists. And there's a number of reasons for doing this. Really NVIDIA GPUs, and a lot of times that process of algorithm development starts in this NVIDIA ecosystem. So the camera is in that ecosystem for a really good reason. We've also developed a system that's really modular, so allowing us to plug in GPS, satellite, lighting modules, and also an SDK that allows the processing of information and data analysis much easier. So imagine being able to take the video data and process with any black box algorithm and push that result up to the cloud as easy as possible. So these are the specs on the camera. I'm going to gloss over this just because it's mostly techie information. The point of this is that we are able to capture in 4K 12 bits and up to 60 frames per second. So it's really many orders of magnitude more information in a underwater scene, or in this case, these are above water cameras. So the paradigm shift is from a serial processor that's really optimized, and this is the processor that's inside of your computer, and it's meant for tasks that are really serial. It just so happens that neural networks are parallelizable, and the GPU is split up into a whole bunch of different processors that allow problems to be broken down into much smaller pieces and processed in parallel. So that's the motivation for putting a GPU inside of the camera. So our improvement to the security market is it's the deep understanding of what is happening in frame, and this is you can translate this to underwater video very easily. So on the left, you have a standard height vision camera. It's counting people. You have to calibrate it, and it doesn't tell us what the people are doing, though. On the right is our camera, and it's running a pose estimation algorithm that we took from a separate project, and we ran a second neural network on top of it to understand. This is one of our developers, David, going through actions. So this allows much deeper analysis, and this is all running on the camera. So we decided that terrestrial applications are really in the wheelhouse of Boulder AI, and marine applications or subsea applications are a different entity altogether. So we created a platform that we can go really deep. Some of our cameras are going to be rated to 3,000 meters, and all of them will have edge computing, really a GPU supercomputer on board. So each one of these devices has a 2 teraflop processor that's able to run algorithms and this SDK in the same ecosystem. So the applications are really vast, and in aquaculture, there's a sea lice problem that we can detect. Sea lice, and especially that requires a lot of resolution. So that's where kind of the edge computing is necessary, because you can't transmit that much information, and post-processing, as Sherry alluded to, is expensive, and data transmission is expensive, especially when you're going from an underwater environment. So edge computing, especially high-performance edge computing, is becoming more and more important. In oil and gas, there's analysis of many different factors that replace ROVs in renewable energy and power. So in power, we actually have, and I'll go through the specific use case, but Fish Passage is a big one that we have been working in since about 2006, and using, starting off with just background subtraction, but moving more and more towards neural networks and processing at the edge. We see a lot of opportunity in desalinization, and obviously the cutting edge, which is researchers like Sherry. So Seaception has an idea to really allow cameras to see like humans do, and there are 30,000 average sensors on a oil platform, but those are structured sensors, meaning that they have a periodic and defined, easily viewable Excel table. And unstructured data is video and audio, and it's very difficult for computers to translate into information that is actually usable. And it's also very difficult to transmit because of the bandwidth limitations. So our big value proposition is distilling that data that's very difficult for typically algorithms to process, to do that at the edge, at the data source. So the ecosystem that we've developed is really deep water camera, and actually we have multiple cameras that are able to run neural networks on the device. We replace these with, and they also have self-cleaning mechanisms so that fouling and growth on top of the devices is cleaned periodically, and the result of this is that you require much less of a connection to the world, and when that data is processed and distilled, it goes up to a cloud. We're using the Azure cloud. You can use any cloud, and really push that data into a place where you can explore and visualize and really do a deep dive into what matters, which is not necessarily the video, but it's the distillate of that. We have this is just the specs on the camera. I'm going to gloss over this a little bit, but the point of this is that we've had cameras like this deployed for many years, and anti-fouling is really important. So with that, I'm going to shift gears a little bit into a project for tracking and identification of fish as they transition from the lower Malad River to the upper Malad River in Idaho Power. And Idaho had literally a person sitting there watching the fish go by one by one. And as it turns out, we've done some analysis on that person, and they're about 80% accurate. It's because people are, even in post-processing, people are not the best video analyzers. It's a fairly boring task, and humans are much better at other things. So this was it started out with foreground isolation, just as Sherry outlined, a background model that subtracts out the foreground objects are detected, and then we use a tracking algorithm. One of the challenges in Fish Passage and fish ladders is the water line, so we put a water line detector in there to make sure that we weren't detecting objects that were not supposed to be detected. So in image, we shifted from this support vector machine method, which took those fish objects and tried to translate them from this input space to feature space. We had to tell it what we thought mattered. And so we were detecting things like eyes, where are the fins, and passing that info to the support vector machine. In the deep neural network method, it splits the problem up into components, and the face on this example is split into lines, and then those lines make up face features like eyes and nose, ears, mouth, and then those are built to create faces. It's much more robust, and we went from about 50% accuracy on species ID to 96% accuracy pretty much overnight when switching to a deep neural network in about 2012. So being that we've kind of talked about this a little bit, I'm going to skip over this a little bit, but the fish passage problem is this particular dam sees about 25,000 fish a month, and so it's kind of a difficult problem for humans. In fact, they're still going through manually. They're still validating data from 2016 because in parallel with our system, they like to validate everything is 100% accurate. So there's quite a backlog because it takes a lot of human processing to go through this. In the lower right-hand image here, that's actually Ben, who used to sit there and count the fish. These are the species we see in the Malad River: is a sucker, trout, and various ages of those. So we were tasked with measuring the length of the fish, which, depending on how far away the fish is, we're within 2 centimeters, so it was fine for them. And then false passes is recognizing that the same fish went past the camera in either direction within, I think they're using 2 minutes. Yeah, so if it goes up and then down and the trout was measured within 2 centimeters, then it's a false pass. So that's really important in knowing just how effective their fish ladder is. So we used the species ID and created a user interface for them to improve their data. Now all of this actually runs on the Azure cloud, and they can self-improve their data. They can retag all of the data that has arrived in real time, and improve the model and actually push down a new model to the camera as soon as that model is ready. So this ecosystem improves over time, and we've got hundreds of thousands of if not millions of tagged species from the Sacramento Delta all the way up to the Pacific Northwest estuaries. So this is obviously one of the more constrained problems. Sherry highlighted a lot of open ocean and less constrained problems. Even in this environment, there's shadows, there's multiple objects, and tracking is notoriously difficult problem to solve. So the more of this we improve here, the more the ecosystem improves. And I apologize, looks like we're missing some text here, but the conclusion here is that we have an AI platform that runs all of the algorithm on the camera, and these cameras are meant to go in places that are really difficult to deploy cameras to typically. I just want to thank Sherry again and Pacific Northwest National Labs, and for the opportunity. Here's our contact information. Again, we have Trevor on the phone as well if there are any questions. But that is what I've got. I'm not sure. Hello?
Yeah, well, thank you, Darren. That was a great presentation. Thank you for you and your team joining us today. And looks like you've got a lot of really interesting things in the works there. At this point, we'd like to open it up for questions from the participants. You can either type your questions into the chat window there, or if you prefer to ask a question verbally, go ahead and do so.
There's a lot of people open off. Actually, not a lot.
And as we move to Q&A, please feel free to place yourself into the question queue by pressing #2 on your telephone keypad. You will hear a notification when your line is unmuted, and at that time, please state your name and question. As well, to submit a written question, use the chat panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Choose All Panelists from the Send To drop-down menu. And we did receive a written question. And for the written question, we have that it was a very informative talk by Sherry. The talk by Darren, while interesting, contained a lot of marketing. To avoid the impression of Teppies being a marketing arm for this OEM, it would have been better to advise the audience in advance that presentation will include OEM marketing and invite other OEMs to present.
I think this is Sherry, and Derek can respond as well, but I just want to say that I don't think the intent of the Boulder AI and Seaception team sharing what kind of things they're working on here was not meant to be some kind of a sales pitch, but just to make you all aware of some technological developments that they're working on that pertain to recording underwater video. We do have another written question. The question is, as tidal devices are placed in the water, how big of a constraint is the distance from offshore in terms of data transfer? So I think the question there is basically about, as devices are deployed farther and farther from shore, how will the data get transmitted back to shore if you're using some kind of a underwater recording system? And I don't think there's necessarily a hard and fast limit on that. If the devices themselves may include cabling back to shore, then some kind of sensor system that maybe a set of video cameras or some other kind of sensor could potentially piggyback with the devices. Yeah, there's different options for that, or in some cases you might want to go with more of an autonomous platform, or one that incorporates some of the things that Darren was talking about, where you're doing more of the computing at the camera itself, so then you don't have to transfer as much data back. You don't have to transfer that raw video back, but rather just the actual extracted information.
And speaking not as an OEM here, but just as someone who has done this before, the distances you're able to get on a VDSL are miles over cable, and I also wanted to make the community aware that edge processing, you can distill data down to bytes, which opens up a whole new application for satellite communication. So if you're doing distillation at the edge, and you can imagine detection of fish species on an isolated platform, you can transmit 12 bytes over like an Inmarsat platform, and that in some cases is all you need.
And just as a reminder, you may place yourself into the question queue by pressing #2 on your telephone keypad for a verbal question.
All right, we have another question submitted via the chat. Have you explored machine learning algorithms with non-video recordings like sonar? How does the algorithm perform? That's an excellent question. Yes, we at PNNL have done some work in the past to automatically detect and track targets in a multi-beam sonar. Our collaborators at the University of Washington are currently working on that problem as well. It's a little more, of a challenging, problem. The sonar can be a little bit more difficult to work with. It's kind of data intensive, and there's not as many tools available for working with it like there are for video. But yeah, so I think that goes back to what I said earlier about one of the advantages of using video is that you can tap into all this research that's going on and all the existing libraries and so forth out there for working with video. I think we're going to see progress. We will see progress for doing similar things with sonar, but I think that's going to happen a little more slowly. All right, well, if there's no more questions at this time, I just want to thank you all again for taking the time to participate here. And if you do have any other questions or thoughts you would like to share with us, please reach out, and we'd be happy to talk with you further.
Thanks, Jerry. And do let us know if you have any questions, anyone. Again, the contact information is there. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you for joining today's conference. The session is now concluded, and you may disconnect.